Thank you very much, Michael. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Speaking of controversy, I just pulled up a quote from James McPherson, the author historian. He had once written, "I welcome disagreement and dialogue, for that is how scholarship and understanding advance." Now, I'm not sure he was really interested in hearing what I had to say about Grant, but it is a great thought. So, fake news is not a modern concept. It was especially widespread during the American Civil War, and Ulysses S. Grant indulged in a great deal of it throughout the conflict and in his personal memoirs. And does everybody see the slideshow on your screens? Because I will be going through that slide by slide, and it's sort of important to the presentation. So hopefully you are aware. I'm not here to argue that Grant was a terrible person or an atrocious commander. I'm quite sure that many of you admire him greatly. His memoirs and his biographers, however, have elevated him to such an exalted level that I felt compelled to compile an expose that highlights the deficiencies in Grant's generalship and in his character. Grant promised that he tried to provide a true account in his memoirs, but the evidence, including his own contemporary writings, all too often contradict him. As general and president, Ulysses Grant had a tremendous impact in war and in peace, and much that he did was praiseworthy. He had an extraordinary life, but many people say that Grant won the war. The devil is in the detail, however. Although he was persistent and personally brave, among many other issues, 5 major factors are often ignored in forming that exalted reputation. His staffer John Aaron Rawlins, the Union's naval power, luck or the fortunes of war, Grant's partiality, and his unreliability as a chronicler of events. Grant's regular U.S. Army service included highly creditable work in the Mexican War, but it ended in a cloud of alcohol on the West Coast. He failed in most of his civilian affairs. Luckily, the Civil War restarted his military career, but it was done through politics. Congressman Lew Washburn of Illinois and other very influential people from that state helped Grant get work under the governor and then get command of a regiment. Yet in his second inaugural address, Grant denied the importance of this crucial political support. Grant said, "I was entirely without such influence or the acquaintance of persons of influence." Just before this, Grant had even considered baking bread, inferior to being a colonel. Yet during his later world tour, he erroneously proclaimed, "When the rebellion came, I returned to the service because it was a duty. I had no thought of rank." That was quite false. Without fighting a battle, Grant was promoted to a brigadier general in the volunteers at Lew Washburn's behest. Washburn gave him important political support throughout the war. Washburn's reward for this? Grant ignored him and his importance in writing his memoirs. Luckily, Grant was assigned to John Fremont's Western Department, where he was only ranked by John Pope and Fremont himself. If Grant had been stationed with the Army of the Potomac, 10 new brigadiers and several new major generals would have ranked him. So Grant was fortunate indeed again. In early September 1861, Confederate General Leonidas Polk breached Kentucky's self-proclaimed neutrality by occupying Columbus. Artillery that would be placed on the Mississippi's bluffs could stop the Union's downriver traffic on the Mississippi. But if Polk was foolish in doing so, and almost everybody agrees that he was, then both Fremont and General Grant were foolish because they wanted to do the same thing. Now, the first major incident where the memoirs falsified history is the occupation of Paducah, Kentucky. After the Confederates occupied Columbus and Hickman, Fremont's spy convinced Grant to occupy Paducah, which was a port at the base of the Tennessee River, where it flowed into the Ohio. And he wanted Grant to do this ahead of the enemy. Grant later boasted in his memoirs that he set off before receiving permission from Fremont. Messages in the official records, however, indicate that Grant had gotten and responded to Fremont's orders. And Grant's unsubmitted report that's in the Library of Congress clearly states that he received Fremont's authorization. And as you can see by the handwriting at the top of the page, I replied, he said, the same day. Now, Grant had chosen many inferior drinking men to be staff members, but he made no mistake in John Rawlins, picking him as Assistant Attorney, Adjutant General, and later Chief of Staff. Now, excuse me. Grant and his people thought that Rawlins was an essential subordinate, but Rawlins' reward for his indispensable services, Grant almost entirely excluded the completely loyal, self-effacing, hard-working subordinate from his memoirs, despite these vital contributions. He was described by people who loved Grant as, and by Grant himself, as absolutely indispensable, invaluable, one of the war's most admirable characters. No one appreciated him more highly than Grant. Success was due to Rawlins' brains and good sense. Rawlins was more necessary to Grant than Grant to Rawlins. Without him, Grant would not have been the same man, and Rawlins is infinitely Grant's superior. Without Rawlins, there would have been no Grant, these people said. Now, Grant's biographers minimize Rawlins, and they add insult to injury. Jeffrey Perret said that Rawlins was a man incapable of loyalty. Even more obtusely, Bruce Canton protested, with a defender like Rawlins, Grant had no need of enemies. Grant likewise ignored his important advocate Charles Dana in his memoirs, while he turned the support of Henry Halleck into an adversary and an incompetent. Now, Henry Halleck wasn't the best general around, but Grant made him even worse than he was, just to make himself look better and because he didn't like Halleck after the war ended. But luckily for Grant, a powerful fleet of transports and gunboats concentrated around Cairo, Illinois, right here. This is Paducah, which he took up the Ohio River from Cairo. These gunboats, both wooden clads in the beginning and then ironclads later on, were extremely important in Grant's success during the war. The steam-driven transports moved and supplied his army, and the flotilla of gunboats overpowered the enemy's forts and interrupted their lines of communication. The Confederates couldn't compete with the Union's naval superior, not in coastal operations, not through the increasingly stringent blockade, or on the western rivers. As to Grant's common sense or keen grasp of strategy, just before being assigned to Cairo, he bemoaned, "I should like to be sent to Western Virginia, but my lot seems to be cast in this part of the world." Now, Western Virginia was a real backwater of the war, one of the backwaters, but Grant didn't know that at the time. Grant then wanted to descend the Mississippi River, when ascending the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers was much more practical. For one, a disabled gunboat attacking downriver would drift into enemy hands. In an upriver attack, it would drift back to safety if it had lost power through a boiler explosion or its engines. Now, Fremont was soon replaced by Henry Halleck, another West Pointer, and Halleck was prejudiced against the so-called political generals. Just below Halleck and Grant was Charles F. Smith, also a West Pointer, and Grant showed him favoritism whenever possible. This switch in commanders gave Grant an opportunity to lead his men down the Mississippi in early November before he could be displaced by a higher ranking officer, just as he stated in late September. Now, despite distinct orders not to, Grant challenged the Confederates in battle. Grant's infantry, with better artillery, overran the Confederates' camp. But Grant lost control of his men, and the enemy got away. Confederates sent more men across the river. Grant was forced to cut his way out, but the retreat turned into a rout, and the rear of his column suffered severely. With the gunboats' protection, his transports cut their hawsers and escaped upriver. It was close, a close-run thing, as they say, but Grant informed headquarters victory was complete. He told his wife and his father that it was most complete. Even Wikipedia has this listed as a U.S. victory. Now, in 1864, Grant sent in a revised report that was basically a forgery. It was backdated to November 17, 1861, I think 7 days after the original report. It had an anachronistic heading and addressee. Lieutenant General Grant at the time signed it Brigadier General Grant. And there were two new outright fabrications that justified his insubordination in attacking. Now, negligence and laziness were lifetime habits of Grant. His biographers overlooked this and further argue that Grant was not personally corrupt, which is ridiculous if you're talking about his presidency. But even in Cairo, two ringleaders under him led a regime of fraud. His assistant quartermaster, Reuben Hatch, was a brother of one of those Illinois politicians who helped secure Grant's colonelcy, and the other was George Washington Graham, Grant's commodore of riverboats. Their swindles encompassed bread, lumber, cordwood, shingles, ice, coal, oats, hays, and riverboats. Grant even admitted the great abuses, but he stalled Hatch's court-martial. Pretty soon, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton sent an eminent committee. They found gross fraud. Assistant Secretary of War Scott, after examining the books, thought it was strange that Army officers, meaning Grant, would certify to such corruption. An officer replacing Graham investigated the contracts, and in a very short time, his explorations appeared to trouble Grant, who placed him under arrest. Grant was reinstated. Now, Grant's delay in doing all of this let politicians convince Lincoln to handpick 3 auditors, because these were members of Lincoln's home state who were in trouble, and the auditors, who included Charles Dana, who soon became Grant's fervent supporter, exonerated both Graham and Grant's management of affairs as well. The author of the book, The Sultana Tragedy, wrote, "It is not surprising that Lincoln's handpicked commission acquitted Hatch of all blame." Grant glowingly endorsed Hatch's return to the service, as he was entirely exonerated in Grant's opinion. At the war's end, however, this Hatch overloaded the transport Sultana with Union prisoners. Going up the Mississippi, it exploded with 1,600 to 1,800 victims. Grant's favoritism had its cost, sometimes monetary, sometimes in lives. Although Grant is often credited, many had the idea for a movement up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Halleck was not unsupportive of the movement. Naval officer Andrew Foote, who accompanied Grant, was also in favor, and he argued for it to Halleck. Now, Grant preferred to assault Fort Donelson first, but he yielded to Foote in trying Fort Henry. The gunboats alone under Foote captured Fort Henry because Grant did not heed Foote's advice to start earlier, and this let the garrison escape. But many applaud Grant alone for this victory. Foote argued later about his objections in attacking Fort Donelson, which Grant pushed him into. And Grant advanced on Donelson in a very aggressive move. It turned out very well, but he did so not knowing how many Confederates were there, or its commander at Fort Donelson. He pushed Foote into a premature naval attack, and it failed. Foote complained about that, and the Confederates knocked out several of Foote's ironclads. The next morning, Grant visited Foote, and he was incommunicado for about 6 hours. Grant had left no orders to his subordinates but to maintain their positions. Where the Confederates assaulted McClernand down here to the south and pushed him out of the way and opening up their escape route, McClernand had no support, and he had insufficient ammunition, so his troops had to retreat. West Pointer Charles Smith did little to help the situation, but the so-called political general Lew Wallace insubordinately sent one brigade, and then he led the rest of his troops basically to stop the enemy's advance. Wallace helped save Grant's army and Grant's career as well. Foolishly, the Confederates decided to give up their escape route and retreated back into the fort. After noon, Grant finally arrived on the field and ordered attacks on both flanks. This caused the rebels to surrender the next day. Foote and Wallace rarely share in the credit for this victory. Halleck pushed Grant's major generalcy through, giving Grant's 2 stars and a very high place in the rankings. Now, after Fort Donelson, Halleck became annoyed with Grant's undisciplined army plundering the fort while captured Confederates escaped merely by walking through the lines. Grant left his army behind to visit Nashville, Tennessee, that was newly captured by Buell and Buell's troops that Grant had sent up the river. Now, Grant didn't send Army strength reports up the chain of command, and there were indications that Grant was drinking again. Due to these factors, Halleck removed Grant from command of the upcoming Tennessee River expedition. Now, John McClernand, Charles Smith, and Lew Wallace were also promoted major generals, and they would figure largely in this next advance up the Tennessee. Halleck had given Smith command of the expedition, even though John McClernand ranked him. McClernand was a political general, and Grant and Smith and Halleck didn't like such people. But Halleck was not Grant's jealous tormentor, as many say, and he soon let Grant resume command. Grant started out well, concentrating his forces around Pittsburgh and Shiloh. He had first found them at Savannah under Charles Smith, but when he took command, Grant brought most of them to the campgrounds around Shiloh Church in Pittsburgh Landing. Now, the Confederates under Albert Sidney Johnston were at Corinth, only 32 kilometers away, just one good day's march from Grant's encampment. Now, Grant had wanted to attack Johnston at Corinth first, but he was restrained by Halleck, who wanted a unified advance with Buell. Buell was marching down from Nashville. Well, Grant had previously just taken boats upriver, which is much easier on the troops to arrive at the battlefield. Now, staying in a mansion at Savannah downriver, which was on the opposite side from his campground, Grant made mistake after mistake, one of which was staying away from his army. But he neglected his army, he ignored proper precautions, despite thinking that the army outnumbered him 2-1. He stopped sending out spies and scouts. He sent out few patrols, especially as the battle was nearing. He had no vedettes stationed. He had the newest, least experienced divisions at the front of his lines. He didn't emplace into artillery. He switched his artillery and cavalry at the last minute. He transferred commanders for political reasons at the last minute. He didn't entrench. He didn't construct entanglements or clear fields of fire. The day before battle, Grant even postponed meeting Buell, even though that was his whole supposed purpose in remaining in the mansion at Savannah. And he refused to forward Nelson's division of Buell's army, claiming they couldn't march through the swamps south of Savannah, even though Nelson was eager to get to the battlefield, worried about what the Confederates might do. When the Confederates actually attacked, they found the Union camps seriously unprepared and surprised them, and it was nearly a Union catastrophe that only Colonel Everett Peabody's insubordinate patrol early that morning preventing a total surprise, and Peabody basically saved Grant's army just by that action, although many other subordinate commanders and the raw troops did very good work. Grant didn't acknowledge these efforts then or really ever. Hearing the battle, Grant at Savannah now ordered Nelson's division to march through those very same impossible swamps. Grant was at Savannah up here, where Nelson was. Before Grant took his boat, he thought that Nelson should march right through the swampy backwaters of the Tennessee to get to the opposite the battlefield and then be ferried across. It took Nelson hours to find out that that was a ridiculous route, and finally Nelson found a guide that took him on the overland route behind the bluffs and then through the swamps at the last minute when it was necessary. So Grant, before leaving, merely notified Buell that battle had begun, but gave him no other instructions. Now, Grant ranked Buell and was given permission by Halleck that in the case of an engagement, he could take command over Buell. Grant never took command from Buell. Buell fought independently both days of the battle. Grant tardily went upriver on his flagship Tigris. He stopped at Crump's Landing, where Lew Wallace's division was separate from the rest of the Grant's army. Lew Wallace confirmed that there was a battle up the river at Pittsburgh Landing, but Grant only told him to be ready to march in any direction, instead of sending him immediately toward the battlefield. Continuing upriver by boat, another boat came downriver from the battlefield and further confirmed the battle. What did Grant do? He did not send this boat downstream to tell Wallace to start marching. He didn't send it further downstream to Savannah to tell Buell that his army was going to be needed in this battle. Grant only reached Pittsburgh Landing around 9:30 that morning. The battle had started around 5. I wrote in my book that Grant had arrived at around 9 o'clock, a mistake in Grant's favor. I later found out by the logbook of one of the woodenclads that he actually arrived 9:30. There's very little doubt about that in my mind. Now, Grant claimed that he immediately sent the Tigris back to Lew Wallace at this point, but the messenger only reached Lew Wallace around 11:30 that morning. If Grant had arrived there at 9:30, Grant was probably lying about when he sent his messenger instead. There's probably a 1-hour delay in giving orders, probably after Grant reached Sherman's encampment and talked to who was effectively the second in command on the field. Really, McClernand should have been in command, but Grant kept him out just out of political spite and liking Sherman better as another West Pointer. Again, Grant sent no boat to Buell. He sent the boat downriver for Wallace's troops, but he didn't seem to want Buell in the battle. He seemed willing to jeopardize success by keeping Buell out of the battle. Now, Lew Wallace was directed to the right of the army. Down here, the number 5 are Sherman's 3 brigades. That was on Sherman's right flank. Not to Pittsburgh Landing, which is back here, as Grant claimed. Grant's staff informed Wallace of the Confederate advance when Wallace had reached this point, and Wallace had to backtrack all the way and only reached the battlefield around sunset. Now, as can be seen, no one with knowledge of the situation confirmed Grant's claim that he sent Wallace at Pittsburgh Landing. That didn't stop Grant from lying about it, and he turned Wallace into a scapegoat for the enormity of the surprise and the near defeat. He thought that Wallace should have converted defeat into victory that very first day if he had only followed orders, but that is quite false. So Grant's memoirs lied about this and about many other events during Shiloh. He wrongly asserted, during the whole of Sunday, the first day, I was continuously engaged in passing from one part of the field to another, giving directions to division commanders. Prentice, one of the 5 divisions on the field, was ordered to hold at all hazards. Hurlburt was just informally told, hold out to the last. That was about the extent of Grant's divisional orders as far as we know. I don't think he gave any orders at the brigade level, except for maybe one apocryphal one. Now, Grant's memoirs also slagged Prentice, who ended up losing 2,200 men when he and another division commander's troops were largely captured. Grant said this was in one of the backward moves, which left Prentice's flanks exposed and enabled the enemy to capture him with about 2,200 of his officers and men. Basically, it was because Grant had allowed him to be captured by not ordering him back to the lines. Prentice, in a speech after the war, which Grant's memoirs vouched for as correct, he remarked that Grant knows I communicated to him at 4 o'clock at the landing and tried to get reinforcements and received orders to hold on, and Prentice said, I held. So if anybody's responsible for Prentice's 2,200 men being captured, it's Grant. Now, besides this episode, Grant had very little impact on the battle on both days. Even according to Timothy Smith, one of his very pro-Grant historians, who admits that Grant stayed most of both days back at the landing instead of being up front with the troops and the other commanders. Now, On the second day of battle, April 7th, Grant was reinforced by Lew Wallace, and he was joined by 3 of Buell's divisions. A 4th division arrived at the very end. Grant never took command over Buell and his army, which did the bulk of the fighting on the second day. And they forced the enemy to retreat back to Corinth, especially with Wallace's help on the other flank. Now later, Grant even forgot that Buell's divisions were on the battlefield except for Nelson's. Some people claim he has a great memory. Now, Grant not only claimed the victory, he said, as to the talk of a surprise here, nothing could be more false. If the enemy had sent us word when and where they would attack us, we could not have been better prepared. That's pure balderdash. Luckily, all the divisions performed well, and the subordinate officers stood up. Grant ignored others, but he happened to praise the twice wounded William Sherman, who was also responsible for both the surprise and the lack of preparations as Grant's second in command on the in the campgrounds and on the battlefield, really. Halleck also lied to protect both Grant and Sherman. He said that the accounts of surprise were utterly false. He said that Sherman saved the day on April 6th, which is also untrue. So the memoirs falsified history again and again. Grant said after the battle, "I am looking for a speedy move, one more fight, and then easy sailing to the close of the war." 2 days after the battle, and thought by the end of the month that the next big battle would be the last in the Mississippi Valley. But in Grant's memoirs, as you can see, he wrote, "I gave up all idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest." Halleck now waited until 3 armies had concentrated before his slow advance on Corinth, Pope's, Buell's, and Grant's. This was protracted by bad weather. He made Grant his second in command of both the reserve and Grant's old army, but the most part of Grant's old army he put under George Thomas, which made Grant dislike Thomas for no reason. There's not any reason from Thomas. Now, Grant took little part in this campaign, generally sulking in his tent. And his wartime praise of Halleck actually turned into hate. He had no problem with Halleck at the time. As you can see, he said that Halleck did quite well, slow but determined and sure work. Grant said later that we're moving slowly but ensure success. He said that there will be much unjust criticism of this affair, but future effects will prove it a great victory. Well, that unjust criticism came from Grant himself. Grant said, "Oh, I'm satisfied we could have captured Corinth in just 2 days." Now, Halleck and Sherman influenced him to stay in the army when he was getting ready to go. A lot of people don't give Halleck credit for this either. They load it all on Sherman. Now, in the next battle at Iuka, Grant tried to pincer Sterling Price, the Confederate, by having Rosecrans, whose plan it really was, have him sneak up from the southwest, and then Edward Ord's ring would attack first up to the north in distracting the enemy here. But Ord didn't attack in time, just sort of stopped. Grant seemingly disappeared. There are secondhand reports that state that Grant and his headquarters at Burnsville and his whole staff were drunk, and Grant was dead drunk. Luckily, when the Confederates attacked Rosecrans, he fended them off in a tough battle, but he basically won, and the Confederates had to escape through a route that couldn't have been covered by Rosecrans due to the lack of time. Now, Grant initially said that I cannot speak too highly of the energy and skill of Rosecrans. And he praised the victory. But then he changed his mind after a second battle at Corinth, and where Rosecrans was again credited for success in the newspapers, and the newspapers are now blaming Grant for the failure to catch Price at Iuka, and he mentioned his drinking. Grant began hating Rosecrans, and he credited Rosecrans' subordinate, a friend of Grant's at the time, Charles Hamilton. Now, that's bad enough. But then after the war, when Grant was writing his memoirs 2 decades later, Grant turned Iuka from a victory into a defeat. He just sort of made up his history as he went along, depending on his favoritism and how he liked certain generals and hated others. Now, although it ended in a decisive victory, Grant's operations around Vicksburg in 1862 and 1863 began with a series of blunders and defeats. Now, this may diminish somewhat from the overall victory, but a decisive victory it was. So number one was Sherman's expedition, which descended the Mississippi River, going upstream from Memphis down to Chickasaw Bluffs, where he failed miserably against a fortified enemy, but he was moving slowly and it was really Sherman's fault. Grant at the same time was moving down from the north, and he was supposed to distract Pemberton and make Sherman's job easier in taking Vicksburg. Unfortunately, his overland thrust collapsed when Van Dorn's Confederate cavalry raided the Union supply base at Holly Springs, just to the north. Grant blamed the post commander Murphy, despite Grant's own mistakes. And also, Nathan Bedford Forrest had raided further up behind Grant's lines and made a mess of his rear command. So Sherman's Mississippi expedition is a fine example of the cost of Grant's favoritism. Both Halleck and Grant surreptitiously excluded John McClernand from command of this, even though Lincoln had chosen him as the commander of the expedition. They did this just so that Sherman could abscond with it. Making this insubordination worse, Sherman's assault failed badly, as I said, through Sherman's delay moving downriver. Now, after taking command, John McClernand grabbed his force back from Sherman, went back upriver, and captured around 5,000 men at Fort Hinman at Arkansas Post. Grant immediately called this a wild goose chase, and he personally took charge of downriver operations. Lincoln didn't stop him, and Halleck actually gave him authority. But when Sherman claimed that Arkansas Post was Sherman's idea, Grant then started liking the idea. Grant then started a whole series of Bayou schemes, which were futile attempts to get on the high ground, either north or south of Pittsburgh, but on the bluffs that would give him and his army a chance to get behind Vicksburg and close in against the river, which was controlled by Federal gunboats. Now, many authors gloss over these months of failure. Grant's men were sick and dying by the score, and the medical surgical history of the United States of the Civil War contradicted his report to the Surgeon General, where Grant claimed that the health of this command will compare favorably with that of any army in the field. Statistics show that to be quite untrue. So Grant's Bayou schemes included the Vicksburg Canal, which he restarted, which many historians blame Lincoln for, but it was Grant's plan, and it mainly failed due to faulty engineering. Number 5 was the same thing, a canal that was under McPherson, another favorite subordinate of Grant's, the Lake Providence Canal leading into other waterways that would join up with the Mississippi River many, many kilometers below Vicksburg. That failed. Again, bad engineering and stretching his resources too thinly. Number 6 was the impetuous Yazoo Pass expedition, starting from the Mississippi River, blowing up a levee, opening up the waterways behind the levee to Federal gunboats and transports full of soldiers. Now, Grant initially just wanted Porter's gunboats to destroy the bridges over the rivers. But then he said, belatedly, oh, let's try to send troops in, and then they can go down the Yazoo River and get on the high ground north of Vicksburg. You sent the troops in too late. The expedition was stymied at Fort Pemberton, and that's as far as it got. They were even in trouble and in danger of being captured themselves if things went wrong. Grant sent in number 7, a naval and army force up to try to get to the Yazoo River, both to get on the high ground and help save the Yazoo Pass expedition. This failed. It almost led to the scuttling of Porter's ironclad flotilla. Porter went in without troops to support him and almost got himself captured. Luckily, Sherman got there in time. Number 8 is the Duckport Canal. That likewise failed to bypass Vicksburg. More but bad engineering, maybe a little bad luck. Now, Grant later argued that he was merely biding his time with all these schemes. He said it would not do to lie idle all this time. The effect would be demoralizing, injurious to the troops' health. He never felt great confidence, he said, but actually he put great faith in them at the time. He said the Lake Providence Canal bids fair to be the most practicable route. Then he had made so much calculation on the Yazoo Pass and by Steele's Bayou. In his memoirs, however, Grant lied. He claimed, "I never felt great confidence that any of the experiments resorted to would prove successful." In the same way Grant admitted at the time, "This experiment failing, there is nothing left for me but to collect all my strength and to attack Haines' Bluff." That's where Sherman's army had come to grief. Again, on March 22nd, Grant had said, "I had made really but little calculation by any other route than Haines' Bluff." Fortunately, he decided against the uphill frontal assault that would have proved abortive. In his memoirs, Grant lied once again. "I had had in contemplation the whole winter," he said, "the movement by land to a point below Vicksburg from which to operate it." As demonstrated, it's quite untrue. He did this only after all other options vanished. In a bit of luck, however, both General Hurlburt, who was in charge of Grant's rear command, because Grant didn't like him as a political general, he and Grant both had the idea of sending Benjamin Grierson's cavalry on a raid. Hurlburt wanted to coordinate it with Grant's operations down the river, but Grant ordered Hurlburt to send it at any time. Luckily, the raid's great timing worked out perfectly, but it was pure chance that it did so. Now, John McClernand had long advocated a move past Vicksburg on the west bank and crossing the Mississippi below. Apparently, Grant staffers James Harrison Wilson and John Rawlins had the same idea, and when it was tried, it worked almost perfectly. Grant deserves great credit for it, as he does for the overland campaign to the gates of Vicksburg. Maybe not as much credit as he claims, but great credit. The 2 frontal assaults all along the line on Vicksburg once he arrived there failed. He blamed the second one in large part on McClernand. This is largely mislaid blame. Now, once his army besieged Vicksburg, with Porter's gunboats controlling the river and with his supplies reaching the army through the Yazoo River, Grant forced the city to surrender. However, controversy surrounded the Satarsha incident, as they call it. This was Grant's alcoholic binge on the Yazoo River during the siege. Sylvanus Cadwallader, a strong supporter and pet reporter of Grant's, and a close friend of John Rawlins, described Grant drinking heavily, stupid in speech, staggering in gait, although he was sober by morning. But then Grant got drunk again the next day, Cadwallader said. And Grant's protege wrote in his diary that General G was intoxicated. That was James Wilson. Now, Dana, after Rawlins' letter had come out about Grant's drinking, he declared that Cadwallader wasn't on the trip, but he still wrote that Grant got as stupidly drunk as the immortal nature of man would allow. 3 people said that Grant was intoxicated. Rawlins wrote before Grant even embarked on the boat that the lack of your usual promptness and your lack of clearness in expressing yourself tends to confirm his suspicions that Grant had been drinking. No one mentioned Grant's sobriety at the time. Grant's friend, Dr. Coteau, who served under him and was also Grant's personal physician before the war, he wrote that in the early years of the war, Grant was addicted to the use of strong drink during the early years of the war. He said that allegations of Grant's yielding to his old habits at this time were founded entirely on facts. Now, in the National Archives, 2 of the gunboat's logbooks help confirm Cadwallader's version. He isn't disproved, as some say, even though Dana did say he wasn't on the boat. Now, since this book, I have found a journal stating that Grant was on Tigris, and Dana, in defending Grant, even said that his seasons of intoxication only occurred once every 3 or 4 months, and when it would not interfere with any important movement. Amazingly, many of Grant's biographers minimize or deny this alcoholic episode. Now, the binge took place while the Federals were retreating down the Yazoo by land, and the Battle of Milliken's Bend was fought on the second day of Grant's binge across the Mississippi River, but close by. Now, Grant had stationed several completely raw black regiments. One was still mustering in, with very inferior arms and no artillery. They were almost driven into the river by attacking Confederates. Grant really thought little of black troops, and he kept them sort of out of the fight as much as he could. Now, Grant's father had been stridently anti-slavery. Grant married into a slave-owning family, and his wife was given slaves by her father. Now, Grant did own one slave, William Jones, but freed him before the war and under unknown circumstances. This fact is misused by biographers such as Ron Chernow in asserting that Grant was against slavery in pre-war Missouri and throughout the Civil War. That is not true at all. 7 months after the war started, Grant's inclination was to keep slavery intact. As late as August 1863, Grant wrote, "I never was an abolitionist, not even what could be called anti-slavery." Now, Grant did support Lincoln in raising black troops, but he agreed with Lincoln in using them only for garrison and fatigue duties, and Grant kept them out of combat even when white soldiers were exhausted. He apparently did nothing to get them equal pay or to permit blacks to be commissioned officers. Now, after the war, Grant took strong grounds in favor of a white man's government and against Negro suffrage. Only as President Grant and the Republicans, wanting blacks to control Southern politics with white ex-Confederates out of favor, then Grant and the Grant was on the right side of civil rights. And he maintained his efforts throughout his two administrations until the end, when they slackened, especially when Grant helped put Rutherford Hayes into the White House. They basically made a deal with the Democrats, who were the white party, to let Hayes get into power, but in doing so, Grant withdrew black troops from state capitals and basically sold out Southern blacks into second-class citizenship that has taken them 100 years to get close to what they used to be. So, after William Rosecrans' defeat at Chickamauga in September 1863, Grant was appointed to command the new military division of the Mississippi. This consisted of the armies of the Tennessee, of the Cumberland, and of the Ohio. Hating Rosecrans, Grant replaced him with George Thomas, whom he didn't much care for either. For whatever reasons, Grant also took a strong dislike against Joe Hooker, who had brought 2 small corps from the Army of the Potomac. Now, Chattanooga, Tennessee was a natural amphitheater. The Army of the Cumberland was partially besieged, not totally besieged as people will have it, in the city of Chattanooga by Bragg's Army of Tennessee that was stationed on Missionary Ridge, and in front of it, the rifle pits below the ridge, and then behind the creek, and then on Lookout Mountain. Now, Missionary Ridge has a 45-degree slope up to a crest about 90 meters high with various saddles. Lookout Mountain was 360 meters above the railroad and road and river routes into town that lay at its base. Now, with the rugged Cumberland Plateau behind, Union forces had only one tenuous route for supplies. It was over here and way to the west, and the horses were dying, and the cavalry raid really messed things up. So the troops were on half and even a quarter or third rations at times. So they were in trouble when Grant took command. Now, Rosecrans and his engineer, William Baldy Smith, had planned a new route put on foot by Thomas the very evening that Thomas replaced Rosie. Grant concurred upon his arrival a few days later, but he had little to do with it. Directed by Thomas, Baldy Smith, and Joe Hooker, it worked to perfection. Troops floated down on pontoons and a raft from Chattanooga down the river in the night, and unbeknownst to the Confederates, got out here and took over the landing place. Other troops marched overland. They took the pontoon boats and built a pontoon bridge. Hooker marched in from the west and stationed his troops at Wauhatchie and linking up with the troops that crossed from Brown's Ferry. And now there was a much shorter line that stopped the city from falling. So Smith, Thomas, and Hooker deserve great credit for it. What had happened? Well, at the time, Grant gave Thomas credit, saying it was set on foot before my arrival. It proved eminently successful. But after the battle, in his memoirs and after the battle, well, now it's, I issued the orders for opening it, and I got the Army of the Cumberland into a comfortable position. He actually had little to do with it. Upon arrival, his staff even complained that they had little to do. Now, as battle neared, Grant gave the tardily arriving Sherman, who marched all the way from near Iuka, who had boated upriver to Memphis and then marched overland all the way to Chattanooga, he gave his friend Sherman the starring role in the upcoming battle. Thomas was to be in support, and Grant tried to keep Hooker out of the fight. But one of Sherman's divisions got stranded behind the Browns Ferry pontoons when it broke. The bridge broke, and Hooker used it in spectacular fashion, the battle above the clouds. He had sent some troops up along the side of Lookout, and they surprised and outflanked the Confederates. And along with the rest of the troops, they pushed the Confederates off the nose of Lookout, and this caused Confederates to have to evacuate not only Lookout, but all the lines behind the creek here, and forcing them to pull back to Missionary Ridge. Now, most people give credit to their subordinates when they do a good job, but not Grant. When he was talking about this wonderful victory, Grant said, there was no such battle. It's all poetry. It was only a skirmish. Well, Grant was to effect a crossing of the Tennessee north of the city, up here, and he was supposed to secure Missionary Ridge up to the tunnel here where one of the railroads went through under the ridge. Now, while Hooker was brilliantly distracting the enemy, Sherman squandered his surprise right along here. He started late, he was fortifying instead of dashing forward, and he stopped too soon. As usual, Grant commended Sherman's efforts regardless of the facts. But as Bridge had ordered, and these are the original orders for battle, Grant had wanted Sherman to make a juncture with some of Thomas's troops that were to march north and go along the base of the ridge, and he wanted the ridge carried. That is not what happened. The next day, the 25th of November, Grant ordered Hooker to the top of the now abandoned Lookout Mountain, even though he thought it was going to be abandoned. Thomas instead directed Hooker to cross the creek, which the bridge had burned, or had been burned, over to Rossville, and he wanted Hooker to operate on the Confederate southern flank. Sherman performed even worse than the day before. He threw his troops in against Confederates piecemeal, a brigade at a time. They were all defeated. He even disobeyed later orders to assault when the battle was won elsewhere. Now, Grant gave Sherman all the troops he required, even a division that was needed by Thomas in Thomas's projected efforts to flank the Confederates from the south. Now, when Sherman failed, Grant wanted to save him by sending a demonstration of Thomas's men from the lines here, where they had captured Orchard Knob, 1 mile, but just to take the rifle pits, the trenches at the base of the ridge. They were supposed to stop there, which was very stupid because the Confederates were on top of the ridge and could pick them off like sardines in a can. So Thomas delayed an hour after this subject was first broached, but Grant forced the issue, putting the men into an untenable position. But what did the men do? They kept going up the ridge, and with help from Hooker, who got across the creek after a while and onto the Confederates' left flank, he did a trident maneuver behind the Confederates, one on the ridge forcing the Confederates northward, and another one in front of the ridge, providing some artillery support, outflanking the Confederates to the south. And with Thomas's men attacking straight away, and immediately after the Confederates were retreating, which made it harder for the troops on top to shoot at the Union soldiers, it was a spectacular victory. Now, Grant later claimed that he meant for the men to ascend the ridge. This was roundly denied by the officers present. Even his pet reporter, Sylvanus Cadwallader, who was at headquarters on Orchard Knob, disagreed. In Cadwallader's later manuscript, he tried to follow Grant's things, and he echoed Grant's version. But in his newspaper article written that very evening for the Chicago Times, he left the battlefield at 10 o'clock to go write his article and get to the rear to report. Historians don't even seem to know about this article. In it, he wrote that Thomas's division commanders were especially instructed to make no attempt to ascend. But when the officers couldn't restrain the men, whole regiments began to dash up the slope in positive disobedience to orders. What did Grant's memoirs say about this whole thing? That the battle, his first orders were as fought. That's completely untrue. He wanted Sherman to win the battle. Sherman failed. He wanted Thomas in support of Sherman. Sherman didn't. Sherman attacked on his own, or Thomas attacked on his own and won the battle in the middle with the help of Hooker, who was to be kept out of the battle. Grant's gross favoritism toward Sherman and Sheridan and his contempt for Thomas, Hooker, and Gordon Granger in this battle show his utter unreliability as an historian. The memoir's claim is just pure balderdash. He just turned the battle on its head. Now, I'll just quickly go through. In the Overland Campaign, he basically did the same thing. It confirmed his severe deficiencies in generalship and tactics especially, and in his character. Grant's strategy was to join Ben Butler's army, which came in from the James River, upriver of Richmond. They actually joined downriver. But he, even though this was a goal that neither of them met, he said that's what he was supposed to do. In the Western Theater, Grant had merely ordered Sherman to go after Joe Johnston, but he left the operations outside of Virginia to Henry Halleck's supervision, abdicating his own responsibility as General-in-Chief of all Union armies as he was at this point. And in Virginia, he thought that the troops garrisoning territory could merely advance in keeping the enemy occupied. This didn't work under Sigel in the Shenandoah Valley. He had more men of the Confederates, but Grant really put him in a bad position, and Sigel failed. Of course, people blame Sigel, not Grant. Grant showed his usual favoritism in this campaign, giving his protégés choice positions. Sheridan got command of the Cavalry Corps, even though he wasn't experienced in that branch, and he rearranged it just to give Grant's staffer, James Wilson, a whole division. But Wilson had only been a staffer up to this time. And then they had to rearrange the other commanders to do this. Grant imposed an unneeded layer of authority over Meade without adding much by his own presence beyond tactical ineptitude. He kept Burnside as a separate army next to Meade's in the Overland Campaign, just so he could be sort of the overall commander and give him a reason for being there. And thus he took command of the Army of the Potomac from Meade. Meade was really just sort of a glorified chief of staff at this point. There was no need for Grant to keep Burnside as an independent commander. Burnside said that he would have waived rank if necessary. Now, Stephen Sears' book, Lincoln's Lieutenants, showed that shortly before marching, Burnside hadn't even been given maps or briefed on operations, and he was directly under Grant's control. Grant and his staff were often negligent in such affairs. Now, Lee's small Grant, when it attacked his flank, when Grant was moving through the wilderness, because Wilson's cavalry didn't screen Grant's army. Although the wilderness terrain negated the Union advantages, especially in artillery and in numbers, Grant decided to attack nevertheless. Burnside's 20,000 soldiers directly under Grant added very little to the battle, except being late and confused. Grant repeatedly wanted Warren to attack, even when it was obvious the odds were unfavorable, that fighting in the wilderness was in no place to make an attack. After the wilderness, Grant moved on. But the story of Phil Sheridan not clearing the direct route southeast of Pennsylvania was miswritten by both Sheridan and Grant. They tried to make it seem like, oh, it was Meade's fault that Sheridan didn't do his job. Grant had a far shorter route directly to Spotsylvania Courthouse than the enemy's path, but because of Sheridan's failure and Grant's, they lost that advantage. Then Grant attacked at Spotsylvania in frontal assaults against fortified lines all along the line, which was one of Grant's typical tactics of not forming his troops into a real battering ram. He did that once on May 12th. May 10th was a small one, which he used it as an example. But even Grant's idea of concentrating his forces at one point, and with the extra luck of the Confederates withdrawing at the time, this still wasn't a great victory. He had Warren and Burnside just attacking frontally and losing men, and there's confusion in the Mule Show. It just didn't work. It had about equal casualties with the enemy, though huge amounts of Confederates were captured. 6 days later, Grant tried another frontal attack at the Mule Shoe, didn't have a chance. He lost 2,000 men needlessly. Abandoning Spotsylvania, he left his force doubly straddling the North Anna River and impaled on Lee's army, invulnerable to an enemy concentration using their interior lines. Lee was sick, however. Grant was luckily able to withdraw without a disaster. Now Grant moved southeast again to Cold Harbor. Here, Grant or his staff gave Baldy Smith bad orders, losing opportunity for early victory. Baldy was supposed to come up from Butler's army, and Grant told him to march at a point behind the lines, not to the front, not to Cold Harbor, where he should have been sent. Again, that was Grant's fault, and the blunder at Cold Harbor can really be assigned to Grant, even though his supporters really try to blame Meade instead whenever possible. So Grant's June 3rd, all along the lines attack failed miserably again. The last point I'll really make is what Grant wrote about Cold Harbor. Grant said that at Cold Harbor, I always regretted that the last assault was made. No advantage whatever was gained to compensate for the heavy loss we sustained. But 2 days later, Cyrus Comstock, one of Grant's staff officers, wrote in his journal that General Grant spoke yesterday, meaning June 4th, the day after the battle, of ordering another assault today, June 5th. Therefore, he didn't regret that his last assault was ever made. Now, the flag of truce is one of the worst parts of Grant's generalship, where he was asked 2 days after the battle, well, by Hancock asking Meade and by Meade asking Grant, if there's something could be done to the troops lying between the lines. Instead of saying, okay, I'll send in a flag of truce right now to get them out, Grant said, oh no, Meade, you can send in a ceasefire flag of truce. And Meade had to correct him and said, no, Confederates don't recognize me as being in command when you're here. You have to do it as a commanding officer. So what did Grant do? He said, oh, I'll send in a message to Lee saying, whenever there's not any firing on the battlefield, I want stretcher bearers to pick up the wounded. That just wouldn't work. There was sharpshooting going on. It was just a foolish maneuver. When Lee told him so, Grant tried again. Grant said, oh, I'll send the stretcher bearers bearing white flags. Now that's not the same as sending a flag of truce to the opposing commander asking for a ceasefire while you got your men off the battlefield. Again, Lee had to tell Grant that's not the way to do it. Finally, Grant, this was days after the battle, there were very few people left alive because of this. Grant said, okay, I'll send a flag of truce, ask for a ceasefire, and this is all not my fault. It's somebody else's fault. I just think that's as Winston Churchill once said, I think it's like, it's not the abdication of generalship, it's the exact opposite of what a general should do. That's what I think Churchill said about Grant's whole overland campaign. So I don't think very highly of General Grant, and I think there's certain reasons to back this up from the primary sources in the war, and just a little logic, a little thought. You may disagree. I expect to hear some really tough questions about my thesis. I'm certainly ready for them. So if anyone would like to begin, and if Mike would like to open it up for discussion, I thank you very much for listening to me blather on for the last hour.